A plasma membrane encloses every cell. It is the outermost boundary, whether it's a unicellular organism such as amoeba, or one from many of the cells from our body, or a cell from mushroom, or a human, or carnation. The main purpose of plasma membrane is to form a barrier from the inside to protect the cell from the external environment or the surrounding area. It also regulates what goes in and out of the cell, and also sometimes besides that it also helps to recognize certain organisms. So there are many functions of the plasma membrane. For example, if our muscle cells are connected to each other, they must be connected in specific ways, and somehow the information must be passed on to the neighboring cells. And those signals are also present on the plasma membrane. We will now explore the plasma membrane and different components of it. The plasma membrane is also called as a fluid mosaic membrane, or it's another. The purpose of calling it a fluid mosaic is that it is a bilipid layer. By bilipid, we mean that there are two layers of lipids. A lipid molecule has a polar head and a non-polar tail. Some of you may have done this in chemistry already. Now these, I'm drawing you two layers of these molecules, and they're shown over here. My drawings are not as pretty as the ones in the book, but here the bilipid layer. The consistency of the plasma membrane is that it is a very fluid, very living, very dynamic in nature. It is not a static structure. Static would be like a fixed wall or a fixed membrane. The texture of the plasma membrane is like of a balloon, and the consistency is that of a salad dressing. If you take a pan of water and you drop some oil droplets on it, and you see the soap, or even or you add soap on there too, and either you can imagine soap water or oil water, and you can see the floating texture that you get. That is the consistency of the membrane, that it keeps on sort of moving and gliding, very, very fluid, very highly fluid in nature. And once we understand the different properties of the membranes, we can see that how this consistency helps it to retain all those functions. The word mosaic is used because the membrane is not just two layers. Within the membrane you can see all these little structures. For example, this region that is stuck over here, and another region over here which is called as the peripheral proteins. The peripheral has to do with periphery, outside. So there are some proteins that are on the outside. There are some proteins that are called as integral. Integral proteins are also called as transmembrane because they cross the entire section of the membrane. Besides that, we will talk about some other regions that are sticking out of this membrane. So on an image of an animal cell, the plant cell would be the outside barrier that will enclose the entire content of the cell inside. Going up to the components that I had mentioned previously, there are three main components of the plasma membrane, and each of these components are embedded into this layer of lipid. Here is an image again of a lipid molecule. A lipid molecule has a head. This round region is called as the polar head. A polar molecule means it's the end that will attach to water, or it has a little bit of association with water. The polar head that's why called as hydrophilic, which means it's water loving. On the other hand, the tail region, which is over here, is the mainly, firstly, let me write it down. This is often mentioned as the tail, and the tail is hydrophobic, which means stays away from the water or repels water. So hydrophilic, as the name tells you, water loving, and water fearing is the hydrophobic. Now each of these lipid layers, notice the way it is present, that the heads are both towards the outside and the tails are sticking to each other, which makes more sense because the heads are polar, so they are away from, if this was the membrane and this was the inside and this was the outside, then the inside and the outside will always have water present, and that's why you have the polar heads towards the water. However, the non-polar tails are adhering, or they are more sticking towards each other. Besides this bilipid layering, bilipid layer is embedded with certain other molecules, and these other molecules are called as phospholipids, and cholesterol is also another one that is embedded in here. Phospholipid, as the name tells you, phospholipids are molecules that they're lipid molecules, but they have regions of phosphorus or phosphorus end to it. Phospho end also makes the molecule polar. That is, this part will make it a little bit polar, and so once the phospholipids are embedded in here, here is another. I'm going to go ahead and highlight it. You've got the phospholipid layer, and it will help it to adhere to the water end. Now, cholesterol is a molecule that is also present in the membrane, and cholesterol gives it a structure to the membrane. It makes it stiffen and gives it strength to the membrane. And certain steroids are also found in the plasma membrane. So we got done with the phospholipids. We saw the cholesterol. I'm trying to see if an image of a cholesterol. Here's the cholesterol. Cholesterol is a molecule that is recognized by this unique shape. I don't know if you can see it over here, but it's got a shape like this. It's got 3 6-ring structures and one. As a matter of fact, let me erase it. Let me start over again. It's got 3 6-ring, but they're like this. They've got 2 stacked up on top of each other and a 5-ring structure. So if you can find these anywhere in the images, that usually represents it's a cholesterol molecule. So I see some over here and I see some over here. Now these will give it strength and keep its fluidity also. The other component of the plasma membranes are proteins. Now the proteins that are present are of different sorts. The peripheral is the name given to those proteins that are present on the either the towards the outside or the inside towards the peripheral region. That's exactly where it comes from. And these are mainly structural in nature, which means that it gives its structure to the membrane. However, the other kind of proteins are called as the transmembrane proteins. The transmembrane proteins are also called as the integral proteins, and these proteins, they pretty much go all the way around. You can see that it's almost impregnated the entire lipids, and it's showing you some pathways in here too, which helps transport certain molecules that we will talk about. And we'll actually get more into this transmembrane in the next slide. Here are some examples of transmembrane proteins. The transmembrane proteins are very important piece of the proteins that are present in the integral part of the membrane. Transmembrane proteins, the first kind, are called as the channel proteins, and the channel proteins are mainly involved in the passage of molecules. You can see the molecule that is shown over here in green, how this molecule is being moved across the gateway or the pathway. Sometimes they form just a stream-like river, and which helps the molecule movement. Without this movement of ions, sometimes channel proteins are very important. ATP would never be produced. So they're very important, especially when we will talk about respiration. We will see how it glides hydrogen ions across the membrane. The other kind of are the carrier proteins. Carrier proteins are also involved in transportation for sodium and potassium ions across a nerve cell even. Without the carrier proteins, sometimes some certain conduction of electrical impulses would be almost impossible. A third kind of transmembrane proteins are called as the cell recognition proteins, and these proteins are mainly they are usually glycoproteins in here. Glycoproteins means that it is it's got a sugar and protein linked together. That's where the word glycoprotein comes in, and these glycoproteins are they also help in mainly recognizing how, for example, certain enzymes can enter a cell. How, so for example, if a host cell is invaded by a pathogen, then this will result in the immunity reaction. So glycoproteins are very important for immunity and for cell responses. Another kind of transmembrane proteins are called as the receptor proteins, and these have a shape that will allow the enzymes or any molecules to bind to that particular cell. So these are usually receptor proteins are usually used for signaling. So they're very good for signaling of certain molecules. For example, signaling of insulin would be because of receptors of insulin present. And lastly, we have the enzymatic proteins, which main function are pretty much enzymatic activities or metabolic reactions. And without the presence of these enzymes, various membranes around the cell, if these membranes were not there, then cell would never be able to perform the many reactions or many reactions that we will talk about later in the chapter of respiration and metabolism. So it's important to realize that the functions of the proteins that are embedded into the lipid layer are very diverse. If without these proteins, the lipid bilayer would not be able to carry out all the regulatory functions that it does. Let's look at another structure that's found in the plasma membrane, and those are the carbohydrate chains. The carbohydrate chains that are present in two forms. One are called as the glycoproteins, the one that I just mentioned previously during during the cell recognition proteins. These are usually recognized for cell recognition. And the other ones are called as the glycocalyx. Glycocalyx are usually are present usually, especially in bacterial cells. They form a cell wall around the bacterial plasma membrane of the bacteria. Besides that, another molecule that is present embedded in the fluid mosaic patterns are the lipoproteins. Lipoproteins, as the name tells you, there are lipid proteins and lipids together, and these are again, they will help in transporting certain molecules from in and out of the cell. So besides having just the carbohydrate, lipids, and proteins, we also have certain molecules that have one end glycogen or sugar, and the other end proteins or lipids with proteins together. And we did mention those in the section when we did the macromolecules.